Good morning, and I'd like to welcome all our alumni around the world to what is actually our fourth Global Leadership Series event. And we've called it today, Can Banks Be Global Leaders on Sustainability? But what we've taken as ever is a big and interesting question that engages, hopefully, our supporters and alumni all over the world. And we're really very spoiled today to have on my left a number of great guests with us. I'm delighted to have Bill Winters, the CEO of Standard Chartered, Jennifer and Jordan-Saifi, who has an amazing job, actually, as what is called the Assistant Private Secretary of His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales, and really supports the whole Commonwealth and Sustainable Markets Initiative, which has been an amazing leader in this and has particular relevance, I think, to what we're talking about today. And then we have, well, he is a guest, but he's also kind of on the team because he's the Deputy Chairman of the Duke of Edinburgh's Commonwealth Study Conferences, Peter Flavel, CEO of Coutts.
Thanks, Alan.
This, as you know, is part of a series we've been running while we haven't all been able to gather together around the world. And I'm delighted by how many people have picked up on it, both live and in recorded forms. So it's tremendous. And we love your feedback. We love ideas. We love follow-up. And we've got time for Q&A after it. I think it's almost impossible to start anything at the moment without putting it in the backdrop of Ukraine. These are clearly appalling, horrifying, and just world-changing events that we're seeing going on at the moment. We don't know what the implications are. It puts question marks over an enormous amount of things in a world that was already full of question marks. But it is likely to be something that will genuinely shape the future of the world, and certainly over the short, middle, and possibly long term. So I think, we've got to say our heartfelt sadness for everybody involved. There are no winners in this one, it looks like, and it looks like a terrible, terrible humanitarian as well as political tragedy on every level. So I think, and that does have some important relevance to the whole issues of sustainability, which I'd like to come to in a while. But the other point I think it's important when addressing our question today, is we've come off the back of COP. And we've been sitting with COP last year. There's a sense of tremendous momentum and progress in the world. And that has changed a huge amount. And I thought, so again, what we're talking about, we're talking it in post-COP. How does that work? Where does it really go? And so I think it's impossible to have today's question debated, really, without looking at it against those two big subjects as a backdrop. And I felt we could almost start with a whole sense of the financial services sector, we learned some time ago, was of systemic global importance. Yep. It really is at the heart of our whole systems, of our social, economic, and political systems even. And when it's come to climate change, one of the most important things I've felt we've seen is it really has committed to this, because it's one of the few sectors that can deliver systemic change. And so that has been, from where I sat, a sense of very exciting and important progress, and an enormous sense of momentum, particularly when running into COP last year. So I just thought I might quickly run down our panelists and see whether they had any of that sense of momentum really, not just running into COP, but coming out of it, and whether that is something that they can see both in the outside sector, but also in their own organisations maintaining. Bill, can I roll the ball to you first?
Yeah. First of all, I'll echo all of your tee-up comments, including the tragedy that we're witnessing in Ukraine right now. And it is and will be world-changing, I think, indefinitely. And no doubt also impacting on the climate front as well, although it's not clear exactly how. But maybe back to your question, I would note first that the momentum into Glasgow was just outstanding. And it was, for me, it was really, really encouraging to be in Glasgow, to see so many of my counterparts and private sector clients of ours who were not just job owning and paying lip service, but were actually making concrete commitments. And I believe that those are genuine, and I don't think any of those have lost any of their effectiveness or intent. That said, the tremendous groundswell of public opinion behind the actions the business was taking, being driven by consumers and shareholders, other stakeholders, I think has been crowded out by the more tragic news of the day. And so I do worry that somehow we lose the momentum from here. I think we're coming into an interesting time now, and obviously the focus will remain on this war and the implications on all fronts, including what does a doubling in the price of oil mean and other commodities for the way that businesses and consumers think about investing in renewables. The price of a solar panel is more or less the same as it was before. Wind turbine, the price of steel and aluminum have gone up a bit, but otherwise, the economics are swinging in favor of renewables. But the pressure, I'm afraid, has dissipated. So I think it's amongst all the other issues that we're all dealing with, finding a way to singularly focus again on how we're going to deliver on those commitments is absolutely critical. I think we can get there, but it's going to take some effort.
And funny enough, when we met at COP, you had a very important line, I thought, which was that this COP, it just shows the level of buying. And I think you used the expression, there's nowhere left to hide now. For big organizations particularly, they've got to decide where they stand on that. And the financial services sector really did get in that one, didn't they? I mean, we've never seen them do anything like that before.
I always find it fascinating. I've been in financial services my whole working life. And at one level, we don't really have much to do with the sustainability agenda at all because we don't actually emit a lot. Yeah. At another, we absolutely are a focal point because we have tremendous leverage over the people that do emit a lot, especially in emerging markets, where the government actions are not always as supportive or as cohesive as we can see in particular in Europe, and now increasingly in the UK. But we are, as much as the banking system became the front line in the fight against financial crime, in applying sanctions and anti-money laundering, which I think we've become pretty good at, right? We've invested quite a bit in getting this right, and we're very effective. We were never the financial criminals, but we're the conduit. We will also be the conduit on the climate change side, and I think whether it's through the Glasgow Finance for Net Zero Alliance, these are really, really impactful organizations doing real work.
Yeah, I think that's got to be encouraging. And Jennifer, you how do I say this, been at this game for a while, in different shapes and forms, and had this thing of gathering people together. Do you feel that cohesion is continuing post-COP? I mean, did you feel it going in, and is it continuing post-COP, or is it fading now?
So it's quite interesting because what His Royal did about this time last year was to bring all the leaders of the Commonwealth together with our CEO community to really talk about, what are their needs, right, in terms of pursuing their green economy ambition, their transition ambitions. And that was a really important moment because he had to be in listening mode at that point in time. Yeah. And so we did 4 regional roundtables with the Caribbean, Pacific, Africa, and Asia. And that really gave us some insight that we then brought to the G7 leaders. So in terms of building moments. And then he again brought that message at the G20. And then immediately, obviously, we had COP. And I think the Prince's message to governments is that it's wonderful that we're coming together in a common narrative for transition, but governments alone don't have sufficient resources to deliver on those commitments. Yep. And they can't do it fast enough to meet the IPCC report challenges. Yeah. And so I think what we found is that there was a swell. I think there was a lot of collaboration between public and private sectors at COP, and then I think it just a little bit faded a little bit, and now we have to ramp up again. And of course now we are dealing with the Ukraine crisis, and what does that mean for our financial markets? And I think His Royal Highness is very much wanting to say we still need to lean in, as he did when the pandemic started. It could easily have been put off to the end of the agenda, but he kept with it. And I think that was his message this morning: is keep with it and keep going. And so we're looking to do the same type of thing. We have the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Rwanda in June. Immediately after that, we have the G7, G20 in Indonesia, and then COP27 in Egypt. And His Royal Highness went to Egypt immediately after COP to again deliver that message, to bring that continuity, because we have to keep leaning in if we're going to achieve the 2030 targets. And
I mean, from my perspective, watching it, it was very exciting being at COP, just the sheer energy and drive in this. But and levels of commitment, but it was more corporate and consumer. It wasn't as much the government. You didn't feel that the governments walked away going, we did it. It was much more, as you say, the Global Financial Group, the GFANZ group. That's where I felt. So do you feel that, because where you sit, you cross over those two so clearly, do you feel the governments are now coming around to it, or do you think that is fading?
No, I think that it is actually increasing. They're starting to recognize the value and potential of the private sector and the financial sector. And what I think everyone speaks different languages, right? And so sometimes when we're dealing with developing economies, we say, okay, well, tell us, what's your plan? How can we help in terms of investment? And they're very much still thinking in the development paradigm, the grant-making paradigm, and it takes a lot of work to reorganize for an investment perspective. But economic growth potential is so huge if we can get that right, and that's what we're really focused on. But the willingness is there from the large economies like Germany is very, very excited about this, and very fully behind. So I think it's going to be an exciting year if we seize the opportunity.
Yeah, I think that's got to be right, and that's a very important word, the opportunity word. Peter, this wasn't a subject that one associated with Coutts some time ago, and we sit in your wonderful building here. It is something you've animated the business. But what drove that in the organisation? How much of that was the sector or the staff or the customers? What do you feel the driving forces when you lead an organisation? What makes that happen for you in a subject like that?
Alan, I've been here now just on 6 years, and around 5 years ago, we asked ourselves what should be our approach to ESG, environmental, social governance, and the way we invest money on behalf of clients. So we researched our client base, and 3/4 of our clients wanted us to have ESG filters. So while we're this 330-year young private bank, actually we're modern and relevant and contemporary. So it was a bit of a surprise that fully 3/4 of clients wanted us to invest that way. So then we had a big choice, was should we start up a new set of green funds to sit alongside our old funds, or should all funds have ESG filters? And we took the decision that all funds would have ESG filters. So the only way that you can invest with us today is in funds that have ESG filters. Now that led us to saying, well, how are we going to quantify and make sure that we're improving as a business? And that led us to the BCorp journey. And so we started on a journey 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, to seek BCorp accreditation. Now, BCorps are companies that are required by their Articles of Association to take into account people, planet and profit, and take account of all stakeholders in every decision. So it's quite a big deal to make that step as a subsidiary of a listed business. But we took that step, and we're very pleased to be the first UK private bank to be BCorp accredited. Now, the challenge here is, yes, it's great for Coutts to be, we're really proud to be a BCorp, and you have to commit to an ongoing path of improvement. But the real leverage for us is the 20,000 entrepreneurs, successful entrepreneurs that we bank. And so we're encouraging as many of them to come on the BCorp journey alongside us. And so for people listening, if you go online and have a look at BCorp and see if your organisations might like to join that movement, it's a really important movement.
I think there was a sense, and there's quite a lot of people who said, all these commitments to COP, well, they're greenwashing it, they're really not playing. And I think that's why your words about it, nowhere to hide here. These are serious commitments from the top of organisations. And I think people forget what the pressure points for them are, Bill. It's not just, we've got a leader who would like to be nice about it. It is driven, isn't it, by a lot of the sources of funds, the customers, and yes, of course, absolutely the staff as well. But the driving forces they're not letting up, are they, in that way?
No, they're not. And I think that the whole idea of nowhere to hide really was around putting a set of systems in place that cover the various bases. You have to start, you can only reduce your emissions if you know where you're starting, and the data hasn't been so good. It's still not good in big parts of the world. Then you've got to have a plan for how quickly you can reduce, and that has to be tracked and reported and validated. But where does the pressure come from? We're sitting here, we're working in the financial services industry. That's one point of pressure. I think that the more compelling point of pressure is probably from the buyers. So the buyers in the supply chain. For companies that are exporting, think about all those Chinese or Indian manufacturers who are exporting. They're not going to be able to sell to European or American or British companies if they're not green compliant themselves. So if finance is coming from one angle, supply chains coming from another angle, the consumers are coming from their own angle. And then, of course, there's their shareholders and other financiers and governments. So there's a lot of pressure. And if any one of those pressure points turns out to be a bit weak, there's still many others, which doesn't give any of us a right to back off a bit. because we all have our own pressures. I can tell we feel very pressured by our employees, by our shareholders, and I think increasingly by our regulators. That's a good thing.
Yes, I agree. I always have a belief that also one of the pressures on big CEOs is not just their boardroom table, it's also their kitchen table. I mean, kids, the next generation of life
you're right.
come at you, and they're pretty uncompromising. We saw, Carl Icahn take it, McDonald's the other day. It was the pressure from his daughter. And the next gen pressure here is very, very strong, isn't it? And that, I don't feel that weakening. And also, if you want to be the best employer, I mean, most of us all in wars for talent, and you're not going to do it unless you really do look like you're being more of a part of a solution and part of the problem, because we're all part of the problem. The question is how much we're really committed to that. Does that resonate when you're getting talent in the world?
Absolutely.
Because you've been very strong on this.
100%. And it's not 100% of the people for whom this is the top issue, but it's well over 70%. It's in their top 3 issues for where they want to work. And we survey all the time, and also survey people who are leaving. And if they believe that you're genuinely a purpose-led organization, and by the way, I think this pandemic has only made that a much stronger sense, that people really want to know that they're working. Of course, they want to make a living, but they want to feel like they've got a purpose in their lives, and that they're doing something useful. And climate change is right at the heart of that.
Yeah. No, it's funny, it's watching Peter's face when he says how proud they are here to be a B Corp.
Yeah.
There is a pride. I mean, people want to feel it, and if we'll all only win if we've really got that sense of commitment in the organisation. But I mean, I think that the other thing you just picked up on, Jennifer, was you used the word opportunity. Mm-hmm. That's the other swing here, isn't it? Which is, it's been, I think we all learned climate risk is investment risk. It's a whole bunch of other, it's not. In a very serious way. But there is also a sense of new opportunities in the world. And that's a very significant call of what can be done. And not just to solve the problem, but to create new, much more positive things. Are you sensing that energy out there now?
Yeah, and I think what, part of our role as leaders is to encourage and inspire that energy to grow. Because I think the sustainable future is the growth story of our time. Young people, like you say, there's a generational shift here where they want their lives to be meaningful, their work to be meaningful, and part of our job is to connect them with those opportunities, allow them to reimagine the space. And I think we across the Commonwealth have a huge opportunity to shape that for the world, but we need to raise our ambition as high as we possibly can, because humanity needs hope, and it's been very difficult these past few years. So, from a commercial perspective, there's huge opportunity. New technologies are coming on, and innovation is just increasing every day. So. Again, how we seize that, how we connect that with the real economy in real terms is going to be the key to our success.
I see new economies is actually in Standard Chartered expression, which is that's one of the things we're there for. And new economies means a lot of different things.
I think, Alan, but the thing with the Prince of Wales, His Royal Highness, is he's recognised that industry needs to be the solution here. And so he's put together a number of industry roundtables. Bill and I are on the financial services one, but there's one for airlines, for shipping, for fashion, etc. And we all individually as businesses need to do the right thing and have our own plans to net zero. But one of the pennies that dropped in COP was firstly that the cost of inaction is higher than cost of action is higher than inaction, and also that what the Prince of Wales talks about is it's like the Marshall Plan, meaning the rebuilding after the Second World War. Yes. Industries have to be rebuilt. Shipping has to be rebuilt from the water up, perhaps not the ground up. Yeah. And that's why financing is so important. The asset managers, the insurers, the pension funds, the banks, because this all has to be funded. Otherwise, that infrastructure is not going to be built. So the solutions here have to be industry-based solutions. And when I look at financial services, we don't often come together to do industry-based stuff because we tend to compete with each other. That's the nature of corporate life. But this one has to be collective action.
I completely agree, and we've probably spent more time with each other, as we have with other banking CEOs, on this topic
than anything else.
On anything else.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it's because we have a shared agenda. And I think when it comes to the Commonwealth and the role that we as a bank, you as a bank, obviously through the SMI, The relevance is, I find, in many ways greater in many of the Commonwealth countries than it is in places like here at home or parts of Europe or the United States, where there is already a reasonably good system for getting finance into the hands of the people that really need it. That's not always the case in a number of our markets. And there is a role for public-private partnerships that's extraordinarily compelling right now, whether it's a bit of assistance from a UK export credit agency or the World Bank or other multilaterals, the opportunity to blend the private sector initiatives, which are really gathering ahead of steam, with some public funding to catalyze this. It's highly relevant in developing markets broadly, many of which are Commonwealth countries. And then even more compelling when you realize that the ultimate victims of climate change are disproportionately in developing countries, vastly disproportionately. The resilience mechanisms aren't always in place. And the need for funding, the funding gap is much bigger in these countries. So it all sort of comes together to I think is why we welcome so much the work of the SMI and the convening power of the Prince of Wales and your organization. So big thanks to you.
And you're right, though, because you touched a huge issue. One, these are public-private partnerships. This is a whole new generation of it, a new approach to it. And as you said, it's extraordinary to see competing companies and industries come together to try and look for solutions. One of the most urgent places is emerging markets. You've come from them, done a lot of them, and it's a key part of your business. What is the impact now? What are the blocks that we've got to overcome to keep the sense of momentum up now?
Well, the big block, I think, is to establish a sense of achievability. There's a $3.5 trillion financing gap, the vast majority of which is in developing countries. And that's concentrated in Africa, South America, and parts of South Asia, and sort of non-Japan Asia. And that's if there's no sense that $3.5 trillion is obtainable, then people not going to make the plans. They're not going to develop the infrastructure to support that. So we really have to, I think, build the confidence that we can deliver on this over many years. This is a 30-year undertaking here. And we've talked about it a lot. We've made some good progress, but I wouldn't say that the confidence is high that we can actually deliver this.
Because I felt, and you must feel this, Jennifer, that this is a long road. We know it's a long road. We know it's a very steep hill. But what's different, and I felt very different out of COP, these were commitments on the long, but also on a very short. Very specific, and they're measurable, and people are looking at you saying, so, Peter, what are you going to do in the next 3 to 5? And we're going to watch it. And so I think you're right. The question is that enough momentum to get to that kind of commitment? And where you sit, you must see it across all the sectors.
Yeah. I think it's one of the biggest issues we need to solve. And we talked about innovation. And then you might think innovation in terms of technology. We need financial innovation as well. We don't have the right financial mechanisms. And to de-risk, whether it's currency risk, whether it's first loss guarantees, we have a huge challenge in some of these markets. And what we're looking to is like the multilateral development banks, like the World Bank, like the IMF, to come in and help take that risk off the table so the investment can go through. One of the challenges we find is that the capacity to absorb the asset manager, asset owner level of finance is not there through the World Bank. One bank, one of your things, it has as much capital as the entire group of multilateral development banks, right, at its disposal. And so this is the opportunity, but again, like the innovation to be able to build the financial pipeline that will work, and how we get smaller countries to bundle their initiatives, so a regional energy project rather than one by one, like that. Those are opportunities to accelerate. And I think if we're going to focus in our time, let's build the pipelines that we can then channel these funds, but also be very clear about where the alignment regionally might be.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And just, Peter, where you sit, you're dealing with people all over the world. And do you feel now, I've had so many questions this week, so Ukraine puts all this back again. Is what I get a lot of questions. So it's all off the table. Do you feel that in the organisation? Do you have, do people feel they're realigning? Because you must have an awful lot of people saying, "What do we do about Ukraine?" And so does that mean, Peter, one, we move our corporate energy there, and do we pull back from those commitments? So just as an organisation responding in the last few weeks, organisations themselves, let alone their long-term commitments, have just felt we have to respond. Do you feel that's an overwhelming response on that, and this will overshadow it?
I hope not. I mean, the situation in Ukraine is just awful. And where will we be in the Ukraine in a year's time is, we don't know the answer to that. That's an open question. The climate crisis doesn't go away in a year. And so we have to maintain the rage and just keep at it. And as you said earlier, we've got to have these targets for 2030 and 2050 because re-establishing whole industries to be green isn't going to happen next year or the year after. But you don't want to get to 2029 and go, oh, we're a fair way off what we want to do in 2030. So action has to start now. And to Bill's earlier point, we need to make sure, and this seems so esoteric, but we've got to have standards and accounting standards so that people can be held to account. And we can't have some people measuring centimetres and some people measuring centigrade and some people measuring feet and inches. I mean, it's got to be the same metrics so that we can all be held to account. And that's a really important enabler that governments and regulators have to deliver. And once that's delivered, then it's up to us as businesses and industries to then push forward. But you've got to have targets for next year and the year after on the way to 2030 and 2050.
Because that you're a very good picture of it. Your point is it's got to be a framework that people can work within and be held accountable in, and that will stop it being pushed off by other events, because sadly Ukraine probably isn't the last event the world is facing in the next 20 years or so. So I think it's a very clear picture about trying to get big longer-term framework, which is a lot of what SMI has been trying to push for, I know that.
And I also think that we'll need to end up with another set of accounts. Bankers talking about numbers, but companies have profit and loss and a balance sheet and a cash flow. We're going to need another set of some sort of social capital so that we can say, where do we start the year at social capital and where do we end the year at? Now, that's going to be really difficult and it's going to be really woolly at the start, but it's one of those journeys that if you don't start, you'll never get there.
Yeah. Well, on that front, I can't use an opportunity like this without asking Bill about the little thing called carbon pricing. I mean, whatever we put in those new accounts, there's going to be carbon, there's going to be externalities in a whole range of different ways, and there's going to be this journey towards pricing. You haven't given up yet, but you've been right on the front line of a big old battle there.
It's, definitely haven't given up. And in fact, I think we're getting some pretty good momentum. But I'm a firm believer in the power of markets. And I think the part of what caused Mark Carney and then Mark Carney asking me to chair this this task force for scaling the voluntary carbon markets was a belief that markets could accomplish things that are hard for governments to do. And but markets only work if you allow the market to work, and markets can't work if there's no price. And there's got to be one price. And part of the problem with the carbon markets over the past 30 years, they've always been there. Some are quite big. The European emission trading system is a big market, but it's a controlled market. It's controlled by the European governments, and they can make the price go up and down based on how many allowances they float into the market, which is entirely at their discretion. And it works. It has reduced the level of carbon emissions in Europe by a lot through pricing. But it's not a global market, and there's not an agreed set of global standards. So we said, if the market's going to work, we've got to have a single set of standards that everybody agrees is a very high standard, that nobody can question, an unassailable set of standards. And we spent a year with 450 members of a task force from all parts of the value chain.
Amazing.
The big emitters, the oil companies, the airlines, the intermediaries like banks, the NGOs, academics, governments. Although the governments took a sort of more of an observation role in that task force. And we've come up with the first cut of standards, which are in fact very, very rigorous. And as important as the standards themselves is we put a governance framework in place so that those standards could be maintained and curated indefinitely. Science will change, understandings will change. Let's stick with it. It's now up and running. The market increased in size by about 3 times last year. It will increase in size 3 times again this year, would be our forecast. I bet it goes even further now that oil prices and coal prices have gone up so much, because the need to find alternatives is ever greater, just economically. Forget about appealing to people's need to save the planet. Just, cold hard cash is encouraging people into these projects. So But if we get a good, clear, transparent price, then you can make a decision whether you want to take that incremental flight or whether you'd rather invest in something else because you know that there's a real cost in pounds and pence or dollars and cents. And we're not fully there, but I think we're on the road.
But it is real progress.
It's real.
It's real. It's transformative. And the year ahead is what are the rocks you're trying to kick out of the road that will help it push it up the next beach?
I think that there's probably the biggest philosophical debate is whether it's okay to pay people not to destroy nature.
Yes. And that has been a stumbling block for a long time.
That's the real
We've got it in Amazon, we've got it in Indonesia.
If we just do the math, unless you think that there's a possibility that cold fusion is right around the corner and we all get the get out of jail free card, but unless you have that kind of a scenario, if we continue to destroy the Amazon and the Congo Basin or the Indonesian rainforest at the pace that we are right now, today, destroying those natural carbon sinks, we can't get to net zero. We have to stop that destruction. And we can all appeal to human nature and goodwill and say, please stop burning big tracts of the Amazon. But it's not worked. And I think we have to give a really good shot at paying people to do what they should do anyway, but human beings being human beings, they may take the cash from an illicit source rather than taking the cash from a very legitimate source, which is the carbon markets. So let's see if we can protect the existing carbon sinks and then also generate substantial investments to create new carbon sinks.
Yeah, and that is all the natural capital debate that we've just got to push down. It's a big one for you, Jennifer, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, in your convening power, that's one of the things you're also focused on very hard.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the private sector and the financial sector have understood the need for decarbonization and how we aim towards net zero, but the biodiversity question, because it's less tangible, and how do we monetize that? How do we attribute a value to that?
Yes.
And that's something that our Natural Capital Investment Alliance is looking at, where we're bringing some investors to try to tackle that problem. How do you make nature an investment theme? It might not be an asset class, but an investment theme where we have parameters that make sense. And I think the key thing is starting, like you say, starting somewhere. It's going to be messy, but we got to get started or it's going to be too late.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, it's your point about it's fuzzy, but you've got to commit. So you can, and William Blake had a lovely line: "Opposition is true friendship." So it's useful if people challenge it. The challenge will only improve it. They're not going to get it right the first time around.
I also think, Alan, there's also an individual element to this as well. So we've got governments, we've got individual businesses, we've got industries, and we've got us as consumers. And so if I think about the clients of Coutts, they're fairly wealthy people, and they have a much bigger carbon footprint as a result of that. And these old houses that people tend to live in, certainly in the UK, they're not exactly all that carbon friendly. So we're doing a lot of work around helping people be put in contact with people that know how. I mean, those houses are never going to be great, but they can be a lot better than they presently are. And then if they commit to that, we can provide funding at a lower rate than what they would otherwise get that funding. But getting people to understand that the carbon problem that we have is a result of us consuming. So it's not a corporate problem. Corporates have to deal with it, but actually we consume, and that is a cause of these issues. So while I said earlier we have 3/4 of our clients saying we want you to have ESG filters, there are a quarter that said no. And so we do have an education still with some elements of society to really understand how real this actually is. And if you want your great-grandkids not to have hippos swimming around the South Pole, we have to take action right now at an individual level.
And that's again, Ukraine is making people rethink a lot of things here, isn't it? Now we know that post-COVID we've got economy bouncing, so coals are going up again, and everybody's really looking at nuclear. It's not cold yet, but in that world, one's going to have to fight for that. But there's a short-term panic, isn't there? But there is a bigger question of, okay, so we really do have to reset. More people are saying, what is the system we want out of this? And I'm just being blind optimist to believe they're not going to go, we want the coal future, we want the fossil future. They are going to say, we want a new future. Then is that possible? I mean, are you getting financing proposals rapidly to say we need more of that, the wind and solar is by comparative cheaper, we can do it now. What are you seeing in that market?
It's absolutely massive. And the fact that in big chunks of the world now, solar, even before the recent run-up in oil prices, solar was just cheaper. It was cheaper, and cheaper by a lot. Certainly in the whole tropical belt, solar is cheaper by a lot. And now with $120, $130 oil, it's much, much, much cheaper. Wind, a little bit less so, but also very compelling. But we need, I think this is to Jennifer's point as well around innovation. We can't rely entirely on solar, wind, and hydro. And there are also some biodiversity complications for some of those technologies as well. And we've got to take some of the technologies like direct air capture, where we're sucking carbon out of the air directly or capturing it at source and permanently sequestering that. Well, right now, that's completely uneconomic by 5 or 6 times, and we'd have to reduce the cost by 80% for it to be economic. But we know that technology costs do come down by 80%. Solar came down by 98%. Memory chips could come down by 99.9%. So when you get things scaled, you do get those cost advantages, and then we're in business, if we can say. But it's one thing for us to fund a solar farm, which is economic on its own merits. It doesn't require special tariffs or government subsidies. That's kind of easy. It's very hard to finance something that's fundamentally uneconomic, where you're relying either on philanthropic donations or government support, because those are inclined to be pulled away at inconvenient times if you're a creditor. But it's happening, but not in the scale that we need.
No, and that's a sustainability one. Jennifer, the COP was, I always think certain events it can be a great friend. You aim at this thing and things pile up in front of it. We've got Egypt coming. There'll be other huge issues in the world, obviously Ukraine, not the least of them. But do we feel that, the convening power, do you feel that's still spreading the urge to, because you say this is going to be a team sport, it's not an individual game. Do you feel the energy behind that this year? And what do we see about Egypt coming? How will that affect?
I think it's on us. I think it's on us to make it urgent and show up, and that means the private sector, it means governments. I think it's a wonderful opportunity. I know Egypt is looking to have an Africa focus to this COP because there's huge opportunity in Africa. There's opportunity to leapfrog technologies in Africa. And like you said, that many developing countries are the ones worst affected by this crisis, whether that's desertification or loss of biodiversity, genuine poverty. So how can this sustainable future offer green growth opportunities across many of these countries? So I think there's a lot of momentum, but it's really on us to take the decision to make it important.
Because the report last week was another scary one, wasn't it? Like IPCC. that you did think, oh God, do we sink to our knees? Is it possible? And what they say, 1 billion people by 2050. And these are very close-up perspectives now. Certainly if you're a younger generation, 2050 is not far away from another point. How does one keep the sense? How do you keep the sense of optimism, Peter, and that commitment? Because that's going to be a lot of it. When you say it's up to us, there is a leadership game in small businesses, big businesses, at every level and every individual saying. And I think it's a bit of what Bill was talking about. This is doable. If we lose the confidence it's doable, we've got a problem. And yet there is an unknown here that we haven't yet nailed.
Yes. So I'd like to say that the answer should all be carrot. But I'm not convinced of that. I think this is a carrot and stick situation where to maintain the optimism and the energy, we need to remind people of the downside here and make that real. And show people that...
And that was in the report, wasn't it? It was that people are being affected and dying now. We can't see it. That was one of the shocking things. Obviously, they're really laying out, this isn't something that's going to happen out there. This is now happening. So we've got to pick that up.
And show pictures of the Indonesian rainforest 30 years ago, 10 years ago, and today. So that people... Because, that's the power of TV, right? We're talking about Ukraine and part of the reason that these things are so horrendous is we're not just reading about it in a newspaper as you would have done in the weeks after the event in World War I. It's real time, and we've got used to that. So we have to make this thing tactile to people.
Yes, I think it's very visible and very, very clear.
Yeah.
And is that the same sort of sense you feel? I mean, what is going to give you the energy you need, Jennifer? Sitting where you sit, I mean, how do you, what's going to, because you say you need some leadership in it to actually turn up and do stuff, but underneath that there is also there's a sort of underlying energy here. There's signals you've got to pick up on and bring together in a way. And I mean, what are the rocks that you got how many months till, I can't remember, Egypt, if that's your next biggest event. But are there things that you want to change in that? Is it the emerging market energy that's out there? Is it?
I think we've built a relatively strong foundation. I think we call it in this SMI, it's a coalition of the willing. If you're willing to step up and lead and be a brazenly bold leader that the world needs right now, this is your club.
Yeah.
And that includes world leaders, like who wants to step up. We want to keep encouraging and having more and more companies and countries join us in this mission, but we want them to have that spirit of energy and innovation and urgency. And sort of part of my job the next few months is just to keep rallying that support, leveraging His Royal Highness's convening power. And just, I think he comes from a place of authenticity and 50 years of working on this agenda. He genuinely cares and believes in what he's doing. And I think that's a great model for all of us.
No, I think very, 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 very powerful.
And it just reminds me as well, because there may be many people online from the Pacific Islands.
Yes. Yeah.
And I mean, this is real. I mean, this is so actually seeing the world from their perspective, rather than us sitting in our comfy homes here in London, is very real as well.
And that's already begun to show how you can get genuine change by bringing those things to bear. I think that's got to be right. And I think, Bill, in a way, you made your big commitments and you're just driving it now. And I think, obviously Carbon is that, and GFANS and your own organisation, but also leveraging that into the space. In terms of keeping that energy up this year, I don't think you have much of a. I never worried about you keeping energy and commitment, but you do want to feel it around you too.
Yep.
Is there anything? What else could help that happen? Because I agree, on a global basis, this is about cohering people. This is the willing coming together. Are there more things, if you had a magic wand and you could wave it, you would be asking to happen?
Well, it's interesting, to Peter's point, there are carrots and there are sticks. And I think there was a tremendous amount of energy that went into the work that's been done over the past, I'll say 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
We made our first very declarative statements about not financing coal 5 years ago.
Yeah, big deal.
It was a big deal at the time, certainly in the markets where we operate. It's still a big deal, given the way the coal is used. But that crescendoed into a very detailed plan for how we would transition to net zero, but not perfectly detailed. There's more to go. We covered 67% of our emissions. There's 33% left to go, and it's a little bit harder to keep that energy focused on the fine tuning than it is to get the big picture right. But of course, we all know that the devil is always in the detail, and the fine tuning is where I'm going to use every metaphor I can pull. It's where the rubber hits the road.
Yeah.
That's the task now. And just in case we get a little bit slovenly ourselves, we've got shareholders and financiers and our own employees that are holding our feet to the fire, and they do carry sticks.
Yeah.
And
I think the other thing,
that is the big difference. People can now hold you to account in a way that wasn't.
Yeah, but also the things that we're doing now, almost by definition, are the easier things to do. So we set ourselves a target to reduce the carbon intensity of the equity proportion of our funds by 25% over 18 months. We did 38%. I said the equity proportion because actually we don't have the data yet to do the fixed income. Now, we've set ourselves a target of 50% of all asset classes by 2030. So we've got real hard work to do in terms of getting these numbers for all the other asset classes. So that's just my microcosm of the world. All these other industries have got the same things. There are things that are relatively easy to do straight away, and then there's the really heavy lifting.
No, I think that's hugely important. And the Duke of Edinburgh's Commonwealth Study Conferences was born really in 1956 with the Duke of Edinburgh, obviously Prince Charles's father, having a very visionary thought, which is we need to look at the impact of what was then industrialisation on the world And for a long time, that became named globalization. But this is almost one of the biggest impacts that we're all dealing with. And the idea was to involve and engage particularly next generation leaders all over the world, and particularly obviously through the Commonwealth. So hearing the sort of conversation we're having today does feel absolutely, I mean, it is what you might call à point in terms of what one's trying to connect people and engage people and inform people. So I think across our organisation and the alumni, we would like to energise and keep informed on this right around the world and obviously across the Commonwealth. It does feel extraordinarily fitting, and particularly fitting to have, obviously, Representative Prince Charles here today, given the inspirational leadership his father gave to the subject all those years ago. So, no, I mean, it's an amazing moment, and I think it is brought into sharp relief post-COP and in the light of Ukraine. People are going to have to commit to the way they want to see the world and make commitments to making their organisations and play parts in coalitions to make systemic change. And I think that is what I find very inspiring and brilliant to have our team here today. Now, we have a question about questions and how they turn up, if there's anything that we do. We have an online system that I know will come through, but I think we'll probably defer to that as our format, and we can have those responded to quite adequately. I think online is probably the smartest way of doing it today. Because we do have folk literally all over the world. We'll have a solution. What would you like to do? Or how do we do this? So I think, are we allowed just to take a couple very quickly? Would that be acceptable? Well, there's one close to my heart, and I wondered whether it might come through, relevant to Ukraine. But from PBS and in international, agriculture, because we've talked a bit about energy and we've talked about financial services, but food is a revolution coming, isn't it, one way or another? And we're not going to get the climate change again without that happening. And is that going to be a target in the financial industry as well? I mean, how are they going to engage is the question that's popped up on my screen, in terms of, because everybody focused your energy on fossils particularly, as opposed to green shoots. And has that come onto your radar a lot? One feels like for Bill here.
It's definitely probably a lot of ways that we can look at agriculture. One is the role that the land can play as a carbon store. Yeah. And of course, when the rainforests are being burned, they're being burned in order to plant soybeans, yeah, or palm oil, and which is a tremendous release of carbon. So we could say, what's good for food security is bad for the planet. It's not that simple, of course, because there's other ways to use to capture carbon into agricultural soil if done properly, which can be a big extractor of carbon. So that's. But I think agricultural projects, apart from protecting rainforests or existing carbon sinks, are pretty low down the priority list for, at least from what we've seen from our clients, in terms of trying to have a carbon impact.
Because it wasn't a voice barking very loudly at COP, I felt. And yet it's obviously such a massive issue, actually.
But I mean, food security, as we see in Ukraine now, has become a tremendous issue, and that's, I mean, it sort of goes back to the biodiversity point probably as well. There are trade-offs here, and there are costs. If there's one thing about this, the reaction to Ukraine that I'm very encouraged by is that populations, certainly in both of my home countries, this one and the United States, the populations have, and I'm sure it's the case in Europe, tremendously coalesced around the willingness to incur cost.
Yeah.
To have a good outcome. And we didn't really see that on the climate front.
I agree.
We saw it on the threat of Russia, or threat of whatever. We haven't seen it in the threat of climate change, maybe because it's not quite as immediate.
No.
But.
And I think that is true. And I got one, I just thought jumping to your Africa point, because David McCready in Australia also picked up, it's this leapfrogging in particular places. And you highlight the Africa opportunity, didn't you? Do you see that in SMI? I mean, hopefully Egypt will help trigger that on climate change.
Yeah.
But the question, David McCready, is how do we accelerate some of those? Where are the opportunities to leapfrog in a way?
Yeah, and I think, in some part that's, a responsibility of the financial organizations, the multilateral development banks that are they making those choices that will help those leapfrog technologies move faster and incentivize that over others that aren't? And that includes agriculture. It's a huge problem. His Royal Highness has a huge amount of experience in agriculture as a farmer himself, and has views on how do you regenerate that land, and smallholder farms are really important to that story, and around the developing world, that's the way it is. But again, if it can be more profitable to plant for the industrial side, then that's what people will do for the livelihood. So how do we transition this narrative? And again, I think in many ways it comes to innovation. We've had a model of an economic system and markets that has gone into this large-scale industrial production approach, which we see in agriculture. How do we innovate back, not to go back to 200 years ago, but what's the future actually look like? And how do we take the best of both and make it cool and relevant?
Yes, I agree. And Peter's lovely point about industry cohering better.
Well,
coordinating better.
I think also this is to Bill's point on the cost of carbon, the carbon price. It's relatively easy to say that commercial banks should be funding good new infrastructure. But what about the existing industries, one of which is agriculture? And what's going to have to happen is the market is going to have to work. So for those businesses that aren't running their business in a carbon-friendly way, the cost of their capital, the cost of lending to them need to be higher than it is for those businesses that are seeking to do the right thing. So that's why I'm with Bill, that we need a market to be working for that to happen.
Very interesting. I have tons of other questions. How does carbon pricing affect behaviours, and what do we do? Questions out of South Africa. I've got to say, we have guests and alumni, really, joining from Australia, from the UK, from Canada, from India, from Malaysia, from New Zealand, from Kenya to Singapore, to Jamaica, to Samoa, to Barbados, to Papua New Guinea, to Virgin Islands, Bangladesh, South Africa, Switzerland, Zimbabwe, Ghana, Chile, Indonesia, Romania, Germany. I won't go on, Hong Kong.
Wow.
Remarkable list from around the world. And that is really what we're still trying to build, is that network of awareness and connections, because these subjects are massive. And I've got a tumbling sense of questions coming through. Well, if you stick them in Zoom, we'll see how we can respond and whatever it comes from that. But I should really spend my time thanking our three guests today, putting their time and energy into a hugely important subject and doing it in their other lives and bringing it into this session today. And thank everybody around the world for joining us today, and look forward to joining us on the next one coming up, I think, in a few months' time. So thanks for your attention, and really appreciate the time and energy and thoughts.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thanks very much indeed.
In June 2023, 300 young leaders from across the Commonwealth will meet in Canada. For 2 weeks, they'll work together in study groups. They'll tour the country, meet with leaders in government, business, labor, and community service. Their goal, to report as a team on engaged leadership for inclusive change.
Attending this program is worth every ounce of effort and sacrifice that you may have to make in order to join.
You're going to meet leaders who are going to inspire you to even greater heights, and you're already a fantastic leader.
The people you'll meet, places you'll go, the access you'll get to things, it will fundamentally change your thinking.
This conference will determine the type of leader you will be.
It was called The Great Experiment by its founder, the Duke of Edinburgh. Young leaders in business, government, labor, and the community sector from across the Commonwealth gathered in Oxford in 1956 to work, travel, debate, and engage with each other.
The whole success of the conference depends not on what you decide, but what you talk about, and the opinions, however provocative, which are aired.
It was such a success, it was followed by many more global and regional conferences. And now Canada will host Commonwealth Study Conference 2023 under the leadership of Her Royal Highness Princess Anne and Chair Darrell White, CEO of BMO Financial Group. Working together in study groups, participants will explore what engaged leadership for inclusive change means to them.
16 team members from 12 countries. This can happen only in CSC.
Having emerging leaders representing business, representing NGOs, unions, really does create a mixture of very diverse people.
The core lesson was just the importance of listening and learning and acknowledging and entertaining different points of view.
Conference participants will have Canada, the world's second largest country, as their classroom.
You'll have the opportunity to meet, share experiences, and network with high-level leaders of industry, business, civil society, and government. Your perspective of leadership and how to approach the modern sustainable development challenges we all face will be metamorphosized.
We can't fix COVID without cooperation. We can't fix peace and security without cooperation. We can't deal with climate change without cooperation.
When we presented at the end of the program, it really was a distillation of the diversity of the group.
The real powerful message for me was within that diversity, there was great strength.
The Great Commonwealth Leadership Experience is coming to Canada in 2023.
At the bottom of it all, the whole point of everything we do is for the benefit of people.
It's really important the participants for the CSC 2023 come with the unique experience of their countries and share it.
Right now, each one of you thinks you know what leadership is. I would love you to go to that conference and expand your idea of what leadership is.
Your thought process will be challenged by equally bright leaders of tomorrow.
You as a group have to coalesce around what those common values are and what the solutions are and how you can help people.
You'll become a better global citizen, one who understands and can empathize with individuals and cultures globally.
Go to Canada. This is something incredibly unique and incredibly special.